Custody is awarded to the mother.
The judge said without hesitation. They handed custody to a wealthy household without pause. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. The judge cited stability, income, and opportunity while the maintenance worker father stood alone in a pressed courthouse uniform, dismissed as financially unfit and emotionally reactive. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and placed a sealed envelope on the bench. Minutes later, the courtroom would fall silent for a different reason. Because power looks different when truth finally speaks. Before I show you the exact moment when the judge opened that envelope and realized who she had just ruled against, the words echoed against polished oak and marble floors, sharp as a gavel strike even before the wood cracked. Caleb Mercer didn't flinch. He stood straight beside the defense table, hands folded in front of him, courthouse insignia stitched above his breast pocket like a reminder of where he belonged in the room's hierarchy. Across the aisle, Marissa Hale exhaled softly, relief loosening her shoulders. Her fiancé, Ethan Corvell, leaned closer to whisper something she didn't quite answer. Their attorney adjusted cufflinks that probably cost more than Caleb's monthly rent. Judge Adriana Vale continued reading her findings in a measured tone. The court finds that the child's best interests are served by a home environment that provides enhanced educational and international opportunities. International. The word hung there. Caleb felt it land, heavy but expected. He'd heard every argument already: financial projections, private school placements, relocation packages framed as privilege rather than distance. Stability, they called it. Security. A future. Not once did anyone say isolation. The gallery shifted in their seats. A woman near the back whispered, "Poor guy," before being hushed. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, almost louder than the murmurs. Judge Vale looked over her glasses. "Mr. Mercer, you will retain scheduled visitation pending compliance with relocation procedures." Relocation procedures. That meant passports, jurisdiction transfers, legal distance measured in thousands of miles. He nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor, no tremor, no protest. Just acceptance delivered in a steady baritone that surprised even the bailiff standing near the wall. Raymond Soto had seen fathers break in this room, shout, collapse, curse the system and storm out. This one didn't. He stood like a man who had already calculated the cost of this moment long before it arrived. The judge gathered her papers, signaling closure. That's when Caleb reached into the worn leather folder resting against his thigh. Not hurried, not theatrical. He stepped forward. The soft squeak of his work boots on polished floor carried farther than it should have. "Your Honor," he said quietly, holding out a sealed manila envelope, "if the court would enter this into record for immediate judicial review in the event custody was awarded." Judge Vale paused, pen hovering. The attorney on Marissa's side frowned. "Your Honor, we've concluded." "It's documentation already submitted," Caleb added evenly. Conditional review. The courtroom felt smaller suddenly. Judge Vale accepted the envelope with visible reluctance. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Mercer." "Yes, ma'am." She studied the label written in precise block letters. "For immediate judicial review if custody awarded." Something about the handwriting bothered her. It wasn't frantic or desperate. It was exact. Structured. "Very well," she said finally. "The court will briefly recess to examine this submission." A ripple of confusion moved through the gallery. Ethan shifted in his seat. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath. Marissa glanced at Caleb for the first time since the ruling. There was no anger in his expression, no plea, just focus. The judge broke the seal. Paper slid against paper in the otherwise silent room. Charts, financial maps, transfer logs. Cross-referenced timestamps highlighted with careful notation, Not accusations, documentation. Her brow tightened. This, she began, then stopped. Caleb stood motionless, not defiant, not triumphant, waiting. Judge Vale flipped to the next page. Offshore restructuring, trust amendments, conditional guardianship language embedded inside educational relocation contracts. She looked up sharply at Ethan. "Counsel," she said slowly, "why was this court not informed of pending asset transfers connected to relocation?" The attorney blinked. "I'm not aware of." "You will be," she interrupted. The gallery leaned forward as one. Raymond felt the shift first, the subtle crack in authority's smooth surface. Judge Vale turned another page, scanning faster now. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "how did you obtain and structure this analysis?" Caleb's voice remained steady. "Public records, Your Honor." Cross-referenced with submitted exhibits, no boast, no explanation beyond that. But the formatting told a different story. The judge recognized intelligence brief architecture when she saw it. She had clerked for federal judges once. She knew disciplined documentation. Her earlier certainty wavered. Marissa's relief had faded. She looked from the documents to Ethan, whose jaw tightened in irritation rather than concern. "This is speculative," he said sharply. "Financial planning isn't misconduct, concealment is," the judge replied. The air felt thinner now. Caleb's heartbeat remained slow, controlled. He had mapped every transfer, every clause, every quiet maneuver disguised as opportunity. He wasn't fighting for pride, he was preventing disappearance. Judge Vale set the papers down slowly, gaze lingering on the man in the maintenance uniform, invisible no longer. "Court will reconvene," she said, voice altered, measured differently now. "This matter is not concluded." And for the first time since the gavel fell, the balance of power tilted. No one stood. No one even breathed loudly enough to disturb the shift. Judge Vale remained seated, fingertips resting on the stack of documents as though they might disappear if she lifted her hands. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent, but the atmosphere in the courtroom had thickened. "Counsel," she said, eyes still scanning a highlighted column of numbers, "approach." Ethan Corvell rose first, confidence returning to his stride like a reflex. His attorney followed, whispering something urgent. Marissa stayed seated, fingers twisting together in her lap. Caleb didn't move. He remained beside the defense table, posture unchanged, as if the ruling had never wounded him at all. The maintenance insignia on his shirt caught the light. To most people in this room, it still defined him. But not entirely anymore. Judge Vale tapped a page. "These transfers," she said evenly, "were initiated 3 weeks prior to the custody hearing." "They're routine asset reallocations," Ethan replied. "International expansion. Perfectly legal." "Legal doesn't mean transparent," the judge countered. Raymond Soto felt it again, that tremor beneath authority. He had worked this courtroom for 11 years. He knew when momentum shifted. He also knew something else now. This wasn't a desperate father throwing accusations. The structure of those documents was surgical. The judge's gaze lifted. "Mr. Mercer, step forward." Boots pressed softly against polished floor. "Yes, Your Honor." "How long have you worked in courthouse maintenance?" 4 years. "And before that?" A pause, not hesitation, just calculation. "Federal service," Ethan scoffed lightly. Federal service could mean anything. Caleb didn't look at him. "Army intelligence analysis, ma'am." The word settled into the room like a dropped weight. Marissa's head snapped up. Even the attorney stopped whispering. Judge Vale leaned back slowly. "Intelligence analysis, yes, ma'am." Silence stretched, then tightened. "If you're just joining us," the narrator might whisper to an unseen audience, "this is the moment everything changes. And if you believe truth deserves daylight, subscribe with the bell on, because stories like this don't end quietly. The judge cleared her throat. Your documentation mirrors forensic financial tracing protocols. Yes, ma'am. Were you involved in investigations of concealed asset movement? Yes. The attorney stepped forward. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to custodial fitness. It's relevant if material information was withheld from this court, she replied sharply. Ethan's jaw flexed. You're implying misconduct over strategic planning. I'm implying, Judge Vale said coolly, that the court may have been presented with an incomplete financial picture. Caleb's eyes flickered briefly toward Marissa. She looked confused more than defensive. Ethan, what is she talking about? He didn't answer immediately. The judge turned another page. This clause, she said, tapping the document, references conditional guardianship authority triggered by international relocation. Why was that not disclosed in testimony? The attorney swallowed. It's a protective contingency. For whom? The judge asked. No one answered. Raymond watched Caleb carefully. The man wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating. His hands remained folded, knuckles pale but steady. He wasn't attacking, he was protecting. Judge Vale looked at Caleb again. Why submit this only upon adverse ruling? Because, ma'am, he said quietly, if custody remained joint, the relocation clause wouldn't activate. The logic was immediate, precise. The judge's gaze sharpened. Ethan shifted his weight. This is absurd. You're letting a maintenance worker reinterpret corporate planning. Caleb finally looked at him, not angrily, not emotionally, just directly. With respect, he said calmly, numbers don't reinterpret themselves. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Vale raised her hand for silence. Mr. Corvell, were you aware that relocation under this structure could limit Mr. Mercer's jurisdictional challenge rights? That's speculative. It's documented, she corrected. Marissa's breathing had grown shallow. Ethan, you said Lily would still see her dad. She would, he insisted. On schedule, Caleb spoke softly, not to her but into the room. On a schedule defined by corporate trustees, the words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Judge Vale closed the folder slowly. This court does not tolerate strategic concealment, she said. We will recess for extended review. The gavel struck again, but this time not as finality, as suspension, as reconsideration. Ethan's confidence had thinned. The attorney leaned in urgently, whispering about filings and damage control. Marissa stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused. Caleb stepped back toward his table. Raymond met his gaze briefly. There it was again, that quiet composure. Not relief, not victory, just steadiness. The kind of steadiness built long before this room. As the judge rose to exit, she paused. Mr. Mercer. Yes, Your Honor. Her expression was no longer dismissive. Why continue working here, after federal service? The question hung between them. He didn't hesitate. Because this building decides futures, he said evenly. And mine's in it. The courtroom emptied slowly, but no one left untouched. The ruling had cracked, and the man they underestimated was no longer invisible. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Judge Vale, the heavy wood ceiling in a tension that refused to dissipate. Conversations erupted in hushed fragments, lawyers recalculating, observers speculating, the sharp click of expensive heels pacing near the counsel tables. Caleb remained where he was. He didn't chase after the judge, didn't approach Marissa, didn't defend himself against the low murmur of intelligence drifting from the gallery. He simply exhaled once, slow and measured, like a man who had been holding oxygen in reserve. Marissa stood abruptly. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, voice unsteady. He turned toward her. Would it have changed anything? He replied quietly. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Ethan stepped between them, posture stiff. You built a narrative, he said, tone-edged. You're framing strategic investment like conspiracy. I built a timeline, Caleb corrected. That's different. Don't pretend you're some hero. Ethan snapped under his breath. You mop floors. The insult hung there, crude and simple. Caleb didn't react. He had heard worse in rooms that didn't have polished marble and American flags standing in corners. He had heard worse in briefings lit by a single flickering bulb while maps glowed red with coordinates that meant life or death. This was noise. Raymond approached slowly. They'll call you back in, he said quietly. I'll be here, Caleb answered. As the hallway thinned of spectators, Marissa lingered. Her eyes searched his face as if seeing him through new glass. You really did intelligence? She asked. Yes. For how long? Long enough. She crossed her arms, defensive but shaken. Why leave? He held her gaze not unkindly, because sometimes knowing too much costs more than staying quiet. The words weren't dramatic, they were factual. She remembered the year he'd come home different, quieter, the medals boxed instead of framed, the promotion he declined without explanation. She had thought it was pride, or burnout. She hadn't realized it was consequence. Ethan checked his phone aggressively, pacing. This doesn't prove misconduct, he muttered. It proves he can use spreadsheets. Caleb almost smiled at that. Spreadsheets. He remembered encrypted financial trails layered through shell corporations that funded insurgencies. He remembered tracking currency shifts across continents using nothing but timestamp discrepancies and shipment logs. He remembered the moment a superior officer leaned over his shoulder and said, "You see patterns most people miss." Patterns didn't care about income brackets. They cared about truth. The courtroom doors reopened with a muted groan. All parties, Raymond called, voice steady. They returned to their positions. Judge Vale entered last, expression altered, not softened, but sharpened. The kind of focus that came when a judge realized she might have missed something critical. She resumed her seat. This court has reviewed preliminary documentation, she began. The material raises significant concerns regarding transparency and conditional custodial authority. Ethan's attorney stood. Your Honor, relocation planning is not concealment. It becomes concealment when jurisdictional impact isn't disclosed, she replied. Her gaze moved to Caleb again. Mr. Mercer, your analysis references a triggered clause that limits contestation rights once relocation assets are transferred. Yes, ma'am. Explain. The room stilled. He stepped forward, voice calm. If primary custody is awarded and relocation funds are released, the trust structure shifts legal standing to international trustees. That delays any challenge by months, sometimes years. And during that delay, the child resides abroad under contractual guardianship. The words weren't emotional, they were procedural. Marissa's breath caught audibly. That's not what we discussed, she whispered toward Ethan. It's standard protection, he insisted, though the certainty had thinned. Judge Vale interlaced her fingers. Mr. Mercer, why not raise this during the hearing? Because without awarded custody, he said evenly, the clause remains dormant. Raising it prematurely would have allowed restructuring. The judge studied him for a long moment. You anticipated outcome, she said. Yes, ma'am. Not arrogance. Preparation. The courtroom air felt heavier now, weighted by the realization that this father had been 3 steps ahead, not out of manipulation but out of necessity. Judge Vale shifted slightly in her chair. You understand, she said carefully, that your current occupation led this court to assess financial capacity conservatively. Yes, ma'am. And yet your expertise suggests advanced analytical capability. He nodded once. Why maintenance work? A faint murmur stirred again. He answered without hesitation. Flexible hours. Proximity to what? She asked. To my daughter, silence landed hard, not dramatic silence, human silence. Judge Vale's jaw tightened subtly. She glanced down at the documents again, then at Ethan. "Mr. Corvell," she said coolly, "did you believe this court would not examine relocation contingencies? We provided all required disclosures." "Required," she echoed. "Not complete." The distinction was surgical. Raymond felt it in his chest. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about perception, about who gets believed, about which uniform earns respect. Judge Vale lifted the envelope again, as though reassessing the object itself. "A father in a maintenance uniform," she said quietly, almost to herself, anticipated systemic blind spots. Her eyes returned to Caleb. "You said this building decides futures." "Yes, ma'am." "And today," she continued, voice measured, "it may have nearly misjudged one. The shift wasn't victory yet. But it was movement. And movement, in rooms like this, was everything." Judge Vale set the envelope down with deliberate care, as though its weight had changed. The courtroom remained seated, no one daring to assume adjournment this time. Even the air conditioning seemed to hum more cautiously. "This court will hear further clarification," she said. "Mr. Corvell, you may respond directly." Ethan rose slowly. The polish hadn't left him, but something underneath had shifted. "Your Honor, international relocation was presented transparently. The trust restructuring is protective, not restrictive." "Protective for whom?" she asked again. "For Lily's financial security." Caleb didn't look at him. He focused on the judge, hands loosely clasped behind his back. Judge Vale leaned forward. "Your documentation indicates that once the educational trust activates, contestation requires filing in an overseas jurisdiction." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb confirmed. "That would impose significant financial burden on Mr. Mercer." "It would," he said evenly. Marissa's eyes widened slightly. "Ethan, you never said he'd have to file overseas." "It's standard international structuring," Ethan insisted. "Large families do it all the time." Caleb's voice remained calm. "We're not a large family." The statement wasn't bitter, it was factual. A faint ripple of reaction passed through the gallery. Raymond shifted his stance near the wall, watching the subtle exchanges, the way power wavered when challenged with precision. Judge Vale flipped another page. "These timestamp correlations," she said, tapping the document, "suggest asset transfers were initiated immediately after mediation failed." "Yes, ma'am." "Coincidence?" she asked Ethan. He hesitated. "Just for a second." "It was prudent planning," he replied. The judge's gaze hardened. "Prudent planning that wasn't disclosed during testimony." The attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, disclosure requirements were met." "Minimal compliance," she corrected. Caleb felt the rhythm shifting further now. Not in his favor entirely, but away from assumption. He hadn't come here to expose wealth, he'd come to expose timing. Because timing tells truth. Judge Vale addressed him again. "You structured this analysis alone?" "Yes, ma'am." "No external counsel?" "No." The judge studied him longer this time. "Your formatting resembles federal brief architecture." A quiet pause. "It's what I was trained in," he said. The acknowledgement settled differently now, no longer surprising but undeniable. Marissa's shoulders sagged slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked him softly, almost to herself. "You didn't ask," he answered. The words weren't sharp, they were weary. Ethan stepped forward again, frustration surfacing. "Your Honor, are we seriously entertaining the idea that a maintenance employee uncovered corporate misconduct none of our advisors noticed?" Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly. "Advisors look for growth," he said calmly. "Analysts look for exposure." The distinction landed clean. Judge Vale's lips pressed together. She understood that language. Growth versus exposure. Opportunity versus risk. She turned toward Marissa. "Miss Hale, were you aware that relocation under this trust could delay Mr. Mercer's legal challenges by jurisdictional shift? Marissa swallowed. No, I thought it was just paperwork. Paperwork, Caleb repeated quietly, not mocking, just observing. The judge tapped the bench lightly, thinking. The gallery remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted from spectacle to scrutiny. This wasn't about dramatic accusation anymore, it was about process. And process favored preparation. Judge Vale inhaled slowly. This court acknowledges that financial stability is a significant factor in custodial determination. However, transparency is equally significant. Ethan opened his mouth, but she raised a hand. I am not concluding misconduct, she said firmly. I am recognizing omission. Her eyes returned to Caleb. Mr. Mercer, your occupational status influenced the court's earlier assessment of financial parity. Yes, ma'am. Yet your analytical submission indicates substantial capability. He nodded once. Why not pursue similar financial advancement? The question wasn't accusatory. It was curious. He answered without pride, because time is currency too. A faint crease appeared between her brows. Explain, federal contracting required travel, he said. Extended absence. I chose proximity instead. To your daughter, yes. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any financial spreadsheet. Marissa looked at him differently now, not as the man who lost ambition, but as the man who redirected it. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. This is emotional framing, he said sharply. Custody isn't awarded on sentiment. No, Judge Vale agreed. It's awarded on best interest. She looked down again at the clause highlighted in yellow. Best interest requires informed judgment. Raymond felt the room settle into that truth. Judge Vale straightened. The court will not finalize custodial transfer until full financial transparency is reviewed. Ethan's composure cracked slightly. You already ruled, and courts, she replied evenly, retain authority to reconsider when material information emerges. Silence followed. Caleb felt neither triumph nor relief, only vigilance. The door had opened a fraction, that was all. Judge Vale glanced once more at the envelope, a father in a maintenance uniform. She said quietly, almost reflective, anticipated structural blind spots. Her eyes met his. This court will not ignore them. The gavel did not fall this time. Instead, the ruling hovered, suspended between assumption and correction. And for the first time since entering this room, Caleb allowed himself the smallest shift in breath. Not victory, but possibility. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, no audible gasp, just the quiet scrape of chairs and the low murmur of legal recalibration. Judge Vale remained seated, reviewing the envelope again as though rereading it might reveal something she'd missed the first time. Caleb stayed where he was. Across the aisle, Ethan leaned toward his attorney, whispering sharply. We can restructure. Amend the trust. Clarify intent, you can try, the attorney muttered back, tension bleeding into his tone. Marissa looked between them, unsettled. Restructure what? She asked under her breath. No one answered her directly. Judge Vale finally looked up. This court will require full disclosure of all trust documents, transfer schedules, and international jurisdiction agreements within 48 hours. Ethan stiffened. That's excessive. It's necessary, she replied evenly. Caleb felt the rhythm tightening again, not chaotic, but precise. Every movement now would be scrutinized, every filing examined, and that was exactly where he needed this to go. Mr. Mercer, the judge continued, you indicated awareness that raising this concern earlier would allow restructuring. Yes, ma'am, you believed custody would be awarded to Miss Hale, yes, and you prepared for that outcome, yes, there was no bravado in the admission. Judge Vale's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in recalibration. You anticipated this court's reasoning. I anticipated emphasis on income disparity, he corrected gently. The gallery shifted again. Raymond watched the judge absorb that, emphasis on income disparity, not accusation, observation. Ethan exhaled sharply. You're letting him turn socioeconomic bias into leverage. Judge Vale's gaze cut toward him. I don't appreciate the implication. Caleb remained silent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A distant door closed somewhere down the corridor. The building carried on, unaware that one courtroom had tilted. Marissa finally spoke, voice unsteady. Is Lily at risk? The question landed heavier than any financial clause. Caleb turned toward her slowly. Not yet, Ethan scoffed. There is no risk. The delay clause creates risk, Caleb replied calmly. Distance compounds it. Marissa's breathing grew shallow again. Judge Vale interjected. Miss Hale, this court is not alleging harm. It is evaluating procedural transparency, but the seed had been planted. Transparency. Not wealth, not prestige, transparency. Caleb felt the strategy unfolding exactly as he'd mapped it. Public exposure wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about forcing documentation into daylight. And daylight makes patterns visible. If you're still watching, this is where things shift. Where truth stops whispering and starts being recorded. Subscribe with the bell on, because the next step changes everything. Judge Vale lifted the envelope once more. Mr. Mercer, your analysis references secondary beneficiaries not disclosed during testimony. Yes, ma'am. Ethan's attorney stepped forward quickly. Those beneficiaries are passive stakeholders. Passive, Caleb echoed softly. Until activation, Judge Vale glanced at the highlighted section again. Activation occurs immediately upon relocation? Yes. And at that point, she continued, guardianship oversight expands beyond maternal authority? Yes. Marissa blinked rapidly. What does that mean? It means, Caleb said carefully, decision-making could involve trustees outside your direct control. Her head turned toward Ethan, confusion sharpening. You told me it was just a college savings structure. It is, he insisted. With protective oversight, protective from who? She asked. The silence that followed answered more than words could. Judge Vale closed the folder decisively. This court will issue a temporary stay on relocation proceedings pending full evidentiary review. The statement hit the room like a contained explosion. Ethan's composure fractured. You can't. I can, she interrupted. And I will. Raymond felt it fully now, the inversion. The maintenance worker wasn't fighting for recognition anymore. He had already earned it. The conversation had shifted from whether he was fit to whether the relocation was. Caleb didn't smile. He didn't relax. He simply nodded once. Judge Vale studied him again. You understood this could unfold publicly. Yes, ma'am. And you chose that. Yes, why? He answered without pause. Because private objections disappear. The truth of that settled deep. Marissa lowered herself slowly into her chair. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, controlled polish cracking into visible irritation. This is reputational damage over nothing. No, Judge Vale corrected quietly. It is reputational clarity. The words lingered. Public exposure had begun, not loud, not theatrical, but procedural. Documented. Recorded. Caleb felt the weight of the moment press against his ribs. He had calculated every move, but calculation didn't erase emotion. Lily's face flashed in his mind, her small hand gripping his sleeve the last time she'd asked, I'm not moving far, right? He swallowed once. Not yet. Judge Vale signaled to the clerk. Schedule evidentiary continuation. 48 hours. The gavel struck, not as final judgment, but as pause. And in that pause, the power structure continued to rearrange itself. Not victory, but undeniable traction. The gavel's echo faded into the ceiling, and for a long second no one moved. The clerk began gathering files, the soft shuffle of paper marking the difference between assumption and reconsideration. Judge Vale remained seated, eyes lowered to the envelope as though it were less a submission and more a mirror. "All parties are reminded," she said finally, "that this stay does not determine final custody. It ensures full review." Ethan exhaled through his nose, controlled but heated. "Understood, Your Honor." Caleb inclined his head. "Yes, ma'am." Marissa looked smaller somehow, as if the certainty she had walked in with had drained through the cracks in the courtroom floor. 48 hours? She asked faintly. "Yes," the judge replied. Full financial disclosure. The words weren't dramatic. They were procedural. But procedure was where Caleb thrived. As the courtroom began to empty again, Raymond approached the defense table. "You knew she'd stay it," he murmured quietly. "I hoped," Caleb answered. "That envelope," Raymond shook his head slightly. "You built that like a federal brief." He didn't deny it. Outside the courtroom doors, the hallway buzzed with restrained conversation. Attorneys spoke in clipped phrases. Assistants tapped furiously at phones. The news hadn't reached beyond this corridor yet, but it would. Wealthy relocation stalled by a maintenance worker's documentation made for uncomfortable optics. Ethan caught up to Marissa near the water fountain. "This is temporary," he said under his breath. "Don't let him manipulate you." She turned on him slowly. "Did you?" "What?" "Manipulate." His silence stretched half a second too long. Caleb stepped past them, not interrupting, not gloating. His boots tapped softly against the tile, echoing down the corridor. The courthouse smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paper, a scent he knew better than anyone here. This building decides futures. He had meant it. Raymond caught up beside him. "You okay?" He nodded. "I will be. You ever think about going back?" Raymond asked quietly. "Federal work. Thought about it. And?" He glanced toward the exit doors where afternoon light spilled in thin bands. "Lily's school gets out at 3, that was answer enough." Behind them, Ethan's voice rose slightly. "We complied with every required disclosure." "Required," Marissa repeated, the word tasting different now. Caleb didn't turn around. He knew something Ethan didn't. Transparency isn't about what's required. It's about what's revealed. They reached the lobby. Marble floors reflected distorted silhouettes, suits, uniforms, polished shoes, worn boots. Class contrast embedded in architecture. Raymond slowed. 48 hours, he said. "They'll try to fix it, I know. You ready for that?" Caleb's jaw set slightly. Already accounted for it. Because the envelope wasn't just exposure, it was timing. He had mapped projected restructuring pathways, emergency amendments, rapid filings. He had left room for them to move and documented the window in which they would. Public exposure wasn't a single reveal. It was sustained light. If you've made it this far, you can feel the shift too. When quiet preparation meets public scrutiny, outcomes change. Stay with this story, because the next 48 hours will test everyone involved. Raymond clapped a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You don't look scared." "I am," Caleb admitted. The honesty surprised even him. Of losing? Of being right too late, the words lingered between them. Raymond nodded slowly. "She noticed." "The judge?" "Yeah, she noticed." Caleb stepped toward the exit doors. Outside, traffic hummed. The city moved forward, unaware that a child's future hovered in judicial suspension. Behind him, Ethan's voice echoed faintly in frustration. "We'll counterfile. This is optics." Optics. Caleb paused just inside the doorway. Optics fade. Documentation remains. He pushed the door open. Cold air brushed his face, grounding him. For a moment, the weight of the courtroom lifted, replaced by the simpler reality of pavement, sky, and the ticking clock toward school dismissal. 48 hours. He didn't have wealth to deploy. He didn't have private counsel strategizing in glass offices. He had records. Timing. And the truth already entered into court record. Public. Permanent. Poetic justice doesn't announce itself with applause. It builds quietly until the very tools used to dismiss you become the instruments that correct the record. Caleb descended the courthouse steps, shoulders squared, not in triumph, but in readiness. Behind him, through thick stone walls and polished wood, the system recalculated. And this time, it would have to account for him. 48 hours later, the courtroom felt different before anyone even spoke. The air carried anticipation instead of assumption. Reporters hadn't flooded the halls. This wasn't that kind of spectacle, but word had traveled through legal corridors. A relocation trust, a state custody order, a maintenance worker with federal-grade documentation. Judge Adriana Vale entered with sharper posture than before. "All parties present?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the attorneys answered in near unison. Caleb stood at his table, hands resting lightly on the folder he'd carried back in, thinner this time. He had not overprepared. Overreach could fracture credibility. Precision mattered more. Marissa avoided looking at him. Ethan did not. Judge Vale adjusted her glasses. The court has reviewed supplemental filings submitted within the mandated period. She paused deliberately. The amended trust structure was filed yesterday at 4:12 p.m. A flicker crossed Ethan's face. As anticipated, the judge continued. The restructuring attempts to remove delayed contestation language, Caleb didn't move. But Raymond, standing near the side wall, noticed the faint tightening at the corner of his jaw. Anticipated. Judge Vale lifted another document. However, Mr. Mercer's initial submission included projected amendment timelines based on historical restructuring behavior. Murmurs rippled faintly. The judge placed both stacks side by side. The timestamp patterns align. Ethan shifted. "We're being penalized for compliance. You're being examined for sequencing," Judge Vale corrected. Caleb's voice remained steady when she addressed him. "Mr. Mercer, you included predictive modeling in your original envelope." "Yes, ma'am." "You expected corrective filing within 48 hours." "Yes." "And you documented the window in which it would occur." "Yes." The room absorbed the pattern. This wasn't reactive suspicion. It was calculated exposure. Ethan's attorney stepped forward. "Your Honor, predictive modeling does not equal misconduct." "No," she agreed, "but it reveals intent, silence." Marissa finally spoke, her voice thinner than before. "Ethan, why didn't you just disclose everything?" "It wasn't required," he snapped, irritation cracking through. Caleb looked down briefly. There it was again. Required. Judge Vale leaned back slightly. Family court is not a negotiation chamber for minimal compliance. Her gaze moved to Caleb. "You anticipated restructuring because you've seen this behavior before." "Yes, ma'am." "In what capacity?" "Financial concealment investigations." The word concealment hung heavier now. Ethan exhaled sharply. "This is narrative framing." "It's pattern recognition," Caleb replied calmly. The distinction settled across the room like dust after impact. Judge Vale tapped the bench once, softly. "Mr. Corvell, your amended filing attempts to neutralize delayed contestation. Why was it structured that way initially?" "It was strategic asset protection," he said. "For whom?" she asked again. "For Lily." Caleb's voice entered, measured. Then full transparency wouldn't have been a risk. The simplicity of that logic tightened the atmosphere further. Judge Vale studied the documents in silence for several seconds. The ticking clock above the rear exit seemed louder than usual. "This court acknowledges," she said slowly, that financial sophistication alone does not determine custodial integrity. Her eyes lifted. However, strategic omission does undermine credibility. Marissa inhaled sharply. Ethan stiffened. "Are you suggesting—" "I am stating," she interrupted, "that the court's initial ruling was issued without material visibility into custodial relocation consequences." The acknowledgement landed. Not apology. Recognition. Raymond felt something shift permanently then, not just in the case, but in perception. The maintenance worker had not embarrassed the court. He had forced it to see. Judge Vale turned again toward Caleb. "You understood that public record would protect this analysis, yes, ma'am. You chose to let the ruling occur before submitting it, yes. Why accept temporary loss?" His answer came without hesitation. Because irreversible relocation is harder to unwind than temporary custody, the courtroom absorbed that. It wasn't defiance, it was strategy. Ethan ran a hand across his face, frustration visible now. "So what, this becomes a trial about my finances?" "No," Judge Vale said evenly. "It becomes a review of best interest." Her gaze softened just slightly toward Marissa. "Miss Hale, were you aware that trustees could exercise oversight beyond your unilateral control?" Marissa shook her head slowly. "No." The admission cracked something in the room. Judge Vale folded her hands. "This court will convert temporary stay into provisional primary custody retention with Mr. Mercer pending full evidentiary hearing." The words fell like controlled thunder. Ethan's composure fractured. "That's outrageous. It's precautionary," she replied. Marissa blinked rapidly, tears threatening but restrained. Caleb didn't exhale this time. He simply absorbed it. Not triumph, not relief, movement. Public exposure had done what it was meant to do, not destroy wealth, not humiliate status, but illuminate blind spots. Judge Vale lifted the envelope once more. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "this court misjudged surface indicators." He met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am," and this time she continued, voice steady, "we will not." The words lingered in the courtroom like a recalibrated compass. No applause followed, no visible celebration. Just the quiet hum of a system correcting its own balance. Ethan stood rigid beside his counsel table. "You're reversing custody based on speculation," he said, voice controlled, but fraying at the edges. "I am adjusting custody based on incomplete disclosure," Judge Vale replied. "There's a difference." Caleb remained still, hands resting lightly against the edge of the table. He didn't look at Ethan, he didn't look at the gallery. His focus remained on the bench, where decisions hardened into reality. Marissa's voice trembled. "So, Lily stays with him?" "For now," the judge answered. "Pending full evidentiary hearing." "For now," Ethan repeated sharply. "Yes," Judge Vale said. "For now is enough to ensure oversight." The gavel struck once, not to close, but to formalize. Raymond felt the vibration travel through the wooden rail near his post. He had witnessed custody reversals before. They were rarely clean, rarely calm. This one felt surgical. Public. Documented. Corrected. Ethan leaned toward his attorney. "We appeal. You can file," the attorney muttered quietly. "But optics aren't on our side. Optics again." Caleb finally allowed himself a breath that reached deeper into his lungs. Judge Vale looked toward him. "Mr. Mercer, provisional primary custody retention does not absolve you of review. I understand, ma'am, you will submit financial disclosures as well, yes. No special treatment. I'm not asking for any." Her gaze held his a moment longer. "I'm aware," she said. The statement was small. But it mattered. If you've been following this story, this is where truth becomes undeniable. Subscribe with the bell on, because what happens next proves why quiet preparation always outlasts loud power. Marissa wiped at her eyes quickly, frustrated at herself. I didn't know, she said toward Caleb. About the trustees? I know, he replied gently. Ethan stiffened at that exchange. You're painting me like some villain. No, Caleb answered calmly. Just incomplete. The precision of that word struck harder than accusation. Judge Vale gathered her files. This court will schedule a comprehensive evidentiary hearing within 14 days. Until then, relocation proceedings are suspended. 14 days. Time. Time had been the currency he chose years ago when he walked away from federal contracting and its travel-heavy promotions. Time to attend school pickups, time to be reachable, time to build trust. Now time worked in his favor. Ethan stepped forward one last time. Your Honor, this damages reputations. Judge Vale's expression didn't waver. Reputations recover, children's futures do not. Silence swallowed the room. Raymond watched the shift in posture across the gallery. Observers who had once glanced at Caleb with passing sympathy now looked at him differently, not as a man rescued by chance, but as someone who had calculated, prepared, and executed without theatrics. Public exposure had completed its first arc. Not humiliation, illumination. Judge Vale rose from the bench. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck firmly. This time it felt final. People stood slowly, papers shuffled, chairs scraped. Ethan gathered his documents sharply, jaw tight. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath. Caleb didn't respond. He wasn't fighting Ethan anymore. He was fighting timelines. Marissa approached him hesitantly. Can we talk later? About Lily? Yes, he said. There was no triumph in his tone, only steadiness. She nodded faintly and walked away, shoulders no longer squared in certainty. Raymond stepped beside Caleb as the room emptied. You just flipped the whole board, he murmured. No, Caleb corrected quietly. Just leveled it. Raymond studied him. You don't look happy. I'm not, he admitted. Why not? Because provisional isn't permanent. The honesty hung between them. Public exposure had opened the door. Poetic justice had begun its inversion. The man dismissed for mopping floors had forced a federal-level financial review inside family court. But the hearing ahead would be exhaustive. He couldn't afford missteps. As he stepped away from the defense table, Caleb glanced once more at the bench where Judge Vale had sat. The envelope remained on the clerk's desk, archived now. Permanent record. He turned toward the exit, boots tapping against marble that had once reflected only imbalance. Now they reflected something else. Correction in motion. And this time, the system was watching him not as a maintenance worker, but as a father who had refused to disappear. The hallway outside the courtroom felt narrower than before, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to what had just occurred. Conversations unfolded in careful tones. Attorneys recalculated strategy mid-stride. Assistants moved quickly, whispering into phones about provisional retention and evidentiary scheduling. Caleb walked steadily through it. No rush, no visible emotion. Ethan caught up near the elevators, anger sharpened into something colder. You think this makes you righteous? He asked quietly. Caleb pressed the elevator button. No. You embarrassed us. I documented you. The distinction landed clean. The elevator doors slid open with a metallic sigh. They stepped inside, Ethan, Caleb, and silence compressed between mirrored walls. You could have talked to us, Ethan muttered. I did, Caleb replied calmly. In mediation. You didn't mention jurisdictional traps. They weren't active yet, Ethan scoffed. You're twisting semantics. Timing, Caleb corrected. Not semantics. The elevator hummed downward. When the doors opened into the lobby, reporters weren't waiting, but observers lingered. Word had moved quietly through courthouse staff. The maintenance worker had forced a custody stay against a corporate relocation trust. Raymond approached, lowering his voice. Finance review units already requesting copies. Good, Caleb said. That was fast. It needed to be. Public exposure worked because it created institutional momentum. Once documentation entered record, systems reacted to protect themselves. And self-protection often aligned with truth. Marissa stepped into the lobby a few seconds later, slower now. She approached cautiously. I don't want Lily scared, she said. She won't be, Caleb answered. You're not? Trying to take her from me? The question was fragile. No, he said evenly. I'm trying to keep her from being leveraged. The word hit differently than any accusation. Marissa looked down. I thought it was opportunity. So did I, he replied. Ethan's voice cut in. This is manipulation. Caleb didn't turn. It's documentation. The repetition wasn't rhetorical. It was grounding. A pair of junior clerks passed nearby, glancing at him with quiet curiosity. The uniform he wore hadn't changed, but perception had. Judge Vale emerged briefly from a side corridor, pausing when she noticed them. Her expression remained composed, but there was something new in it. Recognition. Mr. Mercer, she said. He turned respectfully. Yes, Your Honor. The evidentiary hearing will include independent financial review. Yes, ma'am. You'll be expected to testify under oath regarding your predictive modeling, I understand. Her gaze lingered a moment longer. You were prepared for that? Yes, good. She nodded once and moved on. Ethan watched the exchange with visible irritation. You turned her? No, Caleb replied. She turned herself. The elevator doors closed again behind another departing group. Raymond leaned closer. Finance review means they'll dig deep, that's the point. You realize if they don't find concealment, they'll still find sequencing, Caleb said quietly. Timing was everything. He had not accused Ethan of fraud. He had exposed omission and predictive restructuring behavior. Even if the trust complied after amendment, the original intent would remain documented, and intent mattered in family court. Marissa stepped back slightly. I need time, she said. You have it, Caleb answered. That was the inversion no one had expected. The man who supposedly lacked resources had bought time. Ethan straightened his jacket sharply. This hearing won't go the way you think. Caleb met his gaze evenly. It already has, not victory, trajectory. As Ethan walked away, frustration visible in every rigid step, Raymond exhaled slowly. You didn't raise your voice once. I didn't need to. You ever get tired of being calm? He paused. Yes. The honesty surprised Raymond again. But anger's expensive, Caleb added quietly. I spent carefully. The lobby doors opened automatically, cool air brushing against them. Outside, the city carried on, traffic lights cycling, pedestrians crossing, libs continuing without awareness that a custody case had quietly shifted judicial awareness. Raymond studied him. 14 days. Yes, you ready? I've been ready. Public exposure wasn't a single moment. It was sustained presence under scrutiny. He would testify. He would explain predictive modeling. He would withstand cross-examination designed to diminish his occupation and inflate his past. And he would remain steady. Because steadiness unsettled arrogance more than outrage ever could. As he stepped onto the courthouse steps, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Lily's school dismissal at 3 p.m. He glanced at the time. Still enough. Time. The currency he chose. Behind him, through layers of stone and glass, the system recalibrated further. Finance units preparing review, clerks flagging amended filings, schedules adjusting. The envelope had not just delayed relocation, it had triggered institutional memory, and institutions, once reminded of oversight risk, rarely ignore it twice. Caleb descended the steps with measured pace. 14 days until full hearing. 14 days for truth to harden into record. and this time the record had his handwriting all over it. 14 days later, the courtroom felt less like a battleground and more like an audit chamber. There were no dramatic entrances, no raised voices in the hallway, just a different kind of weight, the kind that settles when everyone understands this won't be resolved by confidence alone. Judge Adriana Vale entered with a composed, deliberate calm. "All parties prepared?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor." Both attorneys responded. Caleb stood at the defense table, a dark suit replacing his maintenance uniform for the first time in these proceedings. It wasn't expensive. It didn't need to be. It fit cleanly, shoulders squared, posture unchanged. Across the aisle, Ethan's composure had returned, but thinner now, less effortless. Marissa sat between counsel and fiancé, hands clasped tightly. "The court has received findings from the Independent Financial Review Unit," Judge Vale began. Paper shifted lightly across the bench. The review confirms that the original trust structure included delayed contestation language tied to international jurisdiction transfer. Ethan's attorney rose immediately. "Your Honor, we amended that language within the court's time frame." "Yes," she replied. After Mr. Mercer documented predictive restructuring behavior, silence. Caleb remained still. The judge continued, voice steady. "While no illegal activity has been substantiated, the court finds that material custodial implications were not sufficiently disclosed during initial testimony." Marissa's breath caught faintly. Ethan leaned forward. "We complied with disclosure standards. Minimum standards," Judge Vale corrected. "Family court requires comprehensive clarity when relocation intersects with parental access." She turned her attention to Caleb. "Mr. Mercer, you are under oath. Did you anticipate restructuring once your documentation entered record?" "Yes, ma'am. Why?" "Because rapid amendment limits reputational damage," he replied evenly, "and preserves leverage." A subtle shift moved through the room. "You included projected filing windows in your submission," she said. "Yes." "And the amendment occurred within that window?" "Yes." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Predictive modeling isn't proof of intent." "No," Caleb agreed calmly. "It's proof of pattern." The distinction hung heavy again. Judge Vale folded her hands. "The independent review also confirms that activation of the original trust would have transferred jurisdictional authority to trustees beyond maternal sole control." Marissa's eyes flickered toward Ethan. "You told me it was administrative," she whispered. "It was protective," he insisted. Judge Vale addressed Marissa gently. "Miss Hale, were you fully aware of that structural consequence?" "No," she admitted quietly. The admission shifted something irreversible. Judge Vale's gaze hardened, not cruel, but resolute. "This court does not find malicious intent. However, it does find strategic omission." Ethan inhaled sharply. "That's damaging language. It's accurate language," she replied. Raymond, stationed near the wall, felt the room settle into clarity. Public exposure had achieved its full arc, not spectacle. Documentation. Judge Vale continued, "The court's initial custody award placed substantial weight on financial superiority." Her eyes moved to Caleb. That assessment failed to account for analytical competency, stability of proximity, and demonstrated protective foresight. The acknowledgement was measured, not emotional. But it carried weight. Caleb held her gaze respectfully. "The court therefore vacates the prior custody award in full," she said clearly. The words echoed. Marissa closed her eyes briefly. Ethan's composure fractured. "You're punishing us for being prepared." "I am correcting an incomplete evaluation," Judge Vale replied. She lifted the envelope from the clerk's desk, the same one that had begun the inversion. "Mr. Mercer submitted this documentation not to obstruct relocation, but to ensure informed judgment. Her eyes returned to him. That is the court's responsibility, and when oversight occurs, correction must follow. She set the envelope down firmly. Primary physical custody will remain, with Mr. Mercer pending continued co-parenting mediation. Relocation is denied at this time, the gavel struck once. This time, it was not suspension. It was decision. Ethan stood abruptly. "We will appeal." "You are entitled to," Judge Vale said evenly. Marissa looked toward Caleb, uncertainty and relief colliding in her expression. "I never meant to push you out," she said softly. "I know," he answered. "No triumph, no bitterness, just steadiness." Judge Vale addressed him one final time. "Mr. Mercer, yes, Your Honor. Your occupation does not define your capacity, no, ma'am." A faint pause, and this court acknowledges its earlier presumption. It wasn't an apology. It was institutional humility. Raymond felt the shift fully then, the poetic justice of it. The man dismissed for mopping floors had forced a systemic recalibration without shouting, without posturing. Just preparation. Ethan gathered his papers stiffly, frustration visible in every movement. Marissa remained seated a moment longer, absorbing the weight of what had changed. Caleb did not smile. He simply exhaled once. Victory had not been explosive. It had been procedural. And in rooms like this, procedure outlasts pride. The courtroom emptied slowly after the ruling, but the atmosphere didn't snap back to normal. It lingered, like dust still settling after something structural had shifted. Attorneys spoke in lower tones. The clerk handled the envelope with unusual care before placing it into the official archive tray. Permanent record. Caleb remained standing a moment longer than necessary. Across the aisle, Ethan's frustration had hardened into something colder. Calculation for appeal, no doubt. He adjusted his jacket sharply, leaned toward his attorney, and muttered, "We'll challenge jurisdictional reasoning." "You can try," the attorney replied quietly. But the judge built a careful record. That was the point. Marissa approached slowly once Ethan stepped away to make a phone call. She didn't carry the same certainty she had weeks ago. The confidence that money guarantees outcomes had cracked. "I didn't know about the trustees having that kind of reach," she said softly. "I believe you," Caleb replied. Her eyes searched his face. "You could have humiliated us." He shook his head slightly. "That wasn't the goal." Then what was? To keep Lily from becoming leverage. The word lingered again. Heavy, but honest. Marissa nodded faintly, absorbing it. "I thought more resources meant more security. Sometimes," he said gently, "it means more layers." She exhaled slowly, glancing toward the bench where Judge Vale had exited moments before. She looked different today. "She was," he answered. Across the room, Raymond approached, hands resting casually at his belt. "That was clean," he said under his breath. "You didn't scorch anything." "Didn't need to," Caleb replied. "Judge built the correction herself," Raymond added. Caleb nodded once. "That's how it holds." Poetic justice had never been about revenge. It was about inversion. The very criteria used to diminish him, financial disparity, occupational optics, had been re-examined under the light of documented foresight. Judge Vale re-entered briefly from chambers, signaling to the clerk. She paused when she noticed Caleb still near the defense table. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He turned. "Yes, Your Honor." Her tone carried no defensiveness now, only professional clarity. This court's responsibility is impartial evaluation. Sometimes that requires reassessment. "Yes, ma'am. You conducted yourself with restraint. It wasn't personal." A faint pause crossed her expression. "It often feels personal in family court," she said quietly. He considered that. "I know." Her gaze softened just slightly, not in favoritism but in acknowledgement. Ensure co-parenting remains collaborative. I will. She nodded once and stepped away. Raymond let out a slow breath. That's as close to institutional humility as I've ever seen. Caleb allowed the smallest shift in posture, shoulders easing, tension releasing incrementally, not triumph. Resolution. Outside the courtroom doors, the corridor felt different than it had weeks ago. Clerks who once passed him without notice now offered small nods. A junior attorney glanced at him with quiet respect rather than assumption. Perception had recalibrated. But he understood something important. Perception is temporary. Record is permanent. Marissa lingered near the exit. We'll figure out school schedules, she said softly. And holidays, yes, he replied. Her voice trembled slightly. I don't want Lily thinking we're enemies, we're not, he said calmly. Ethan returned, jaw tight. This isn't finished. Caleb met his gaze without hostility. It doesn't have to be a war. Ethan didn't respond. He turned away sharply, pride bruised but not broken. Raymond watched him go. You think he'll appeal? Probably. You ready for that? Caleb exhaled slowly. Preparation doesn't stop. The envelope had done its work. Public exposure had forced transparency. Poetic justice had inverted the imbalance. But fatherhood wasn't a courtroom performance. It was consistency. As he stepped toward the courthouse exit, sunlight spilled across the marble floor in thin gold streaks. His reflection moved across it, no longer dwarfed by suits and polished shoes. Just steady. Raymond walked beside him to the steps. You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't submitted that? Yes. And? She would have been gone before I could challenge it. The simplicity of that truth carried more weight than any legal argument. At the base of the steps, traffic moved in steady rhythm. Life continued without awareness of what had shifted inside those stone walls. Raymond clapped his shoulder lightly. You didn't just win custody. No, Caleb said quietly. You reminded the system to look twice. He considered that. Maybe that was the ripple effect. Not wealth defeated, not status humiliated, just oversight corrected. He checked the time on his phone. School dismissal approaching. He stepped away from the courthouse, not as a maintenance worker dismissed by income disparity, but as a father whose steadiness had rewritten the narrative. The courthouse doors closed behind him with a muted thud, sealing in weeks of tension, filings, and recalculations. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the pavement in long amber streaks. Traffic moved steadily. A bus sighed to a stop at the curb. Life continued, unaware that inside those walls a quiet correction had taken place. Caleb descended the steps without rushing. He didn't feel taller. He didn't feel vindicated in some cinematic way. He felt responsible. Across the street, he paused briefly, glancing back at the stone facade. The same building where he replaced light fixtures and polished floors. The same corridors where attorneys once walked past him without eye contact. The same courtroom where a single envelope had shifted perception. Power looks permanent from the outside, until documentation forces it to reconsider. His phone vibrated gently in his palm. School dismissal reminder. He exhaled slowly and started toward his truck, boots steady against concrete. The engine turned over with its familiar low rumble. No luxury vehicle, no polished emblem. Just reliability. As he drove, his mind replayed the moment Judge Vale had said the words, vacates the prior custody award in fall. Not loudly, not emotionally, but definitively. Poetic justice hadn't come with applause. It came with careful language and recorded correction. The very factors used to diminish him, income disparity, occupational optics, had been examined under a different lens. Capacity, foresight, proximity. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. Same face, same steady gaze, But something subtle had shifted. He was no longer invisible inside the system. He was documented. The school parking lot buzzed with familiar chaos, parents waving, children running, backpacks bouncing against small shoulders. Caleb stepped out of the truck just as the doors opened. Lily spotted him almost instantly. "Dad," she called, sprinting toward him. He knelt slightly as she collided into his chest, arms wrapping tight around his neck. "You came," she said into his shoulder. "I always do," he replied softly. That was the victory. Not the courtroom. Not the reversal. Consistency. She pulled back, studying his face. "Are we moving?" "No," he said gently. "Not right now." She nodded, satisfied with that. Children understand presence more than paperwork. As they walked back to the truck, Lily slipped her hand into his. Small, warm, certain. Behind them, other parents talked casually about homework and soccer practice. None of them knew how close he had come to losing this ordinary moment. That was the quiet truth of it. Injustices don't always look dramatic. Sometimes they look procedural. Sometimes they look like a signature placed without full visibility. And sometimes they're corrected by someone the system never expected to question it. He buckled Lily into her seat and closed the door gently. Driving home, she talked about a spelling test and a classmate who cheated at kickball. He listened, nodding, asking questions. Fully present. No headlines, no spectacle, just fatherhood. At a stop sign, she looked at him suddenly. "You're not mad at Mom, right?" He paused briefly. "No," he said carefully. "Grown-ups make mistakes too." She considered that and nodded. Mistakes, not enemies. That mattered. When they pulled into their modest apartment complex, sunlight caught the windshield just right, briefly flooding the cabin with warmth. Caleb turned off the engine and sat there for a second, hand still resting on the steering wheel. Public exposure had corrected the record. Poetic justice had inverted assumption, but the real victory sat beside him, swinging her legs and humming absent-mindedly. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it wears a maintenance uniform and studies patterns while others underestimate it. He stepped out, opened Lily's door, and walked with her toward the building entrance. Before we close this story, tell me, what injustice should we tackle next? Subscribe and don't miss our next story, Single Mom Denied Loan, until the banker opened her old file. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?